They told the athletes the Olympics were above politics. And then, one winter night, politicians proved they were lying. Christmas in 1979. While most of the West was thinking about families and holidays, someone in the Kremlin signed an order that would break the games. Not in Moscow. In Kabul, Soviet transport planes began landing in Afghanistan. Paratroopers jumped out into the cold. Armored vehicles rolled off ramps. Special forces units headed straight for the presidential palace. Within 48 hours, the leader of a sovereign country was dead, and a new one had been installed at gunpoint. Here is why that matters for a track meet scheduled 7 months later. For decades, the Olympics had been sold as the one place where the Cold War paused. 2 weeks where you could pretend the world was not divided into rival blocs sitting on nuclear weapons. 2 weeks where you could cheer for a Soviet gymnast and an American swimmer in the same evening without feeling like you were betraying anyone. That illusion depended on one thing: the idea that, no matter what the superpowers did elsewhere, they would not drag the games into it. The invasion of Afghanistan shattered that balance. And it did it in the 1 year the Soviets were about to host the world. This is where it turns. When American officials first got the cables about Soviet tanks crossing the border, the instinct was familiar: condemnation, sanctions, cut off grain sales, kick them out of a few diplomatic clubs. But none of that would be visible to ordinary people watching television. Grain deals do not make front-page photos. Closed-door meetings do not interrupt the evening news. The Olympics did. Billions had already been spent in Moscow, stadiums renovated, a new Olympic village built, propaganda posters printed. The entire Soviet system had tied its self-image to those 2 weeks. They were supposed to prove to the world, and to their own citizens, that communism could host a festival just as grand as any capitalist country. So the White House asked a different question. Not, how do we punish the invasion? How do we embarrass the invader? The answer they arrived at was simple and devastating. If the United States and its allies refused to attend, the Soviet victory on the battlefield would come with a global humiliation on live television. The pictures the Kremlin wanted the world to see: American sprinters in Moscow, Western tourists in Red Square, flags from every continent circling Lenin's likeness, would not exist. On paper, it looked elegant. No missiles, no soldiers, just empty lanes in the pool and empty seats in the stadium where Americans were supposed to sit. On paper, the human cost lived in places no president visited: training centers in Colorado and California, small towns in Iowa and Yorkshire where parents had mortgaged houses to send their kids to meets, Soviet-built halls in Eastern Europe where gymnasts did the same routine 1,000 times, dreaming of a week in July. Because while politicians saw leverage, athletes saw the finish line. Most Olympic sports do not make you rich. They make you tired. You get up in the dark. You train while your friends go to parties. You measure your life in personal bests, qualifying standards, and the hope that one day you will hear your name in a stadium instead of just in a local paper. By late 1979, the people who had actually earned the right to march into Moscow had already paid their price. Years of work, injuries, missed holidays, deferred careers. They assumed the world of politics would at least keep its promise. You can see the moral imbalance already forming. The men who ordered tanks into Afghanistan would not lose a minute of sleep over missing an Olympics. They were not going to compete. The men in Washington deciding how to respond had not spent 4 years training for anything but elections. But the people whose lives revolved around that one date in 1980, they were about to discover they had never been the main characters in this story. This is the part they do not talk about in the highlight reels. When you watch documentaries about Moscow '80, you see images of boycotting nations' flags absent from the opening ceremony. You see news anchors summarizing the USA boycott. What you do not see are the days between Christmas and the State of the Union, when the idea went from a suggestion to a threat to a decision. Inside the White House, advisors argued. Some believed attending and using the games as a stage for protest would be more powerful. Others believed that sitting next to Soviet officials in the VIP box while their army occupied a neighbor would make America look weak. One argument cut through. The Olympics were the one weapon everyone would notice. Numbers became ammunition. 15,000 athletes expected to compete. More than 80 countries already committed. Billions of viewers worldwide. Every number made the same point. If you could turn that spectacle off for the Soviets, you could hit them harder than any speech. Here is where it hits your life. If you were a fan watching this on television in early 1980, you probably heard the decision framed as principle. We cannot in good conscience send our athletes to a country that has just invaded its neighbor. It sounds noble. It plays well in a speech. But if you were one of those athletes, the words landed differently. You heard, "We will punish them by punishing you. You had done nothing in Afghanistan. You did not vote for any invasion. You did not command any troops. Your only crime was being good enough at your sport to be useful as a symbol." And once people in power discover they can use your life as a symbol, they almost never give that power back. This is the decision that guaranteed everything that came next. Because when the United States chose to wield the Olympics as a diplomatic weapon, it taught every other government the same lesson. If the games can be used once to send a message, they can be used again. The flame that was supposed to belong to competitors, to children watching at home, to the idea of peaceful contest, now belonged to states. They would decide who could carry it. They would decide who could see it. They would decide when to snuff it out. 1980 did not start with an opening ceremony. It started with the realization that the stadium and the battlefield were now part of the same map. They were told the decision was about principle. It felt like theft. In January 1980, the president went on television and told a generation of athletes that their dream no longer belonged to them. It belonged to foreign policy. He did not say it that way, of course. He spoke about aggression, sovereignty, the need to stand firm against an invasion half a world away. But if you were sitting in a training center in Colorado Springs or a small gym in Ohio, you heard something very different. You heard, "We are going to stop the Soviet Union by stopping you." Here's the part that never shows up in the official timelines. The boycott was not announced with a single sentence and then politely accepted. It arrived in waves, hints, threats, deadlines. First, the White House floated the idea in briefings. If the Soviets did not pull out of Afghanistan, the United States might have to reconsider its participation in the Moscow Games. Then the pressure campaign began. The president called the United States Olympic Committee to the White House. He did not ask what this would mean for the athletes. He asked whether they would support a boycott. When they hesitated, he made it clear that funding for amateur sport in America depended on their answer. This is where it turns. The Olympics had always been sold to athletes as something separate from politics. American teams did not march under the president's flag. They marched under the Olympic rings and their own. They were told their job was to represent their country, not their government. 1980 exposed that as a myth. When the moment came, the same politicians who had insisted sport was neutral treated the team as if it were just another branch of the state, like an embassy or an aircraft carrier, a symbol that could be moved or withheld as needed. The mechanism of the boycott made that clear. Congress passed a resolution urging non-participation. The president signed an executive order restricting travel and the use of federal funds for any team that tried to go anyway. Corporate sponsors, terrified of being seen as unpatriotic, pulled support from any athlete who even hinted at defying the boycott. On paper, the decision was framed as a choice. In reality, it was closer to an ultimatum. If the United States Olympic Committee sent a team, it could lose government recognition. If athletes went independently, they might lose their funding, their visas, even their shot at competing 4 years later. The human cost was measured not in numbers, but in birthdays. Take a distance runner who had been building toward 1980 since 1976. They were 22 in Montreal. They would be 26 in Moscow. Their body was at its absolute peak. Now, at 4 years, they would be 30 in Los Angeles. In a sport measured in hundredths of a second, those 4 years might as well be 40. For some disciplines, you get one realistic shot: gymnastics, diving, certain track events. If you miss that window because someone moved the finish line, there is no do-over. That is what the boycott took. Not just a trip, a lifetime's one chance. And here is what nobody told you during the speeches. The people who paid that price did so without knowing whether it would achieve anything. When the president announced the boycott, he gave the Soviets a deadline. Leave Afghanistan or lose the games. They did not leave. No one seriously believed they would. Once troops are on the ground, superpowers do not retreat because swimmers stay home. The boycott went ahead anyway. This is the moral imbalance. Leaders could claim the high ground either way. If the Soviets had pulled out, they could have declared victory. When the Soviets stayed, they could still say, "We stood on principle." They won in the press conference either way. The only people who could truly lose were the ones whose performance would never be measured. There is no medal for the race you are not allowed to run. This is where it hits your life. Imagine being an athlete whose parents had mortgaged their house to keep you in training. They believed the promise that sport was above politics. They believed the sacrifices were worth it because there would be one moment when everything else in the world stopped and you stepped onto a track or into a pool representing more than just yourself. Then one morning, you learn the decision has been made without you. Not just, "We are boycotting." You are boycotting. You can speak out, but the cameras will frame you as selfish, unpatriotic, willing to ignore an invasion for the sake of a personal goal. Most did not have the stomach to fight that narrative, so they swallowed their anger in public and let it eat them in private. Here is the part they do not talk about in the official retrospectives. Years later, when historians measured whether the boycott worked, they looked at geopolitical outcomes. Did the Soviets leave Afghanistan faster? Did it weaken their standing in the world? The answers are fuzzy. The war lasted 9 more years. The Soviet Union collapsed for many reasons. You can argue forever about how much a missing American delegation mattered. What you cannot argue about is what happened to the bodies and minds of the people whose careers it ended. Some retired immediately. They could not face another 4-year cycle. Others tried to hold on and found, in '84, that their times were slower, their landings harder, their recovery longer. All of them had to live with the knowledge that their peak had been confiscated for a strategy whose results they would never be allowed to measure. The boycott did not just steal a lifetime from one class of athletes. It taught future generations a cruel lesson, that you could do everything right, train hard, win trials, qualify fairly, and still have your moment taken away for reasons that had nothing to do with anything you had done. From that point on, anytime a government talked about supporting our athletes, those who remembered 1980 heard a quiet footnote. Unless we need you for something else. That realization would echo 4 years later when another superpower decided to repay the favor. Because once you have turned the Olympics into a bargaining chip, you cannot complain when the other side starts playing the same game. They thought Moscow would be the low point. They were wrong. 4 years after the United States led dozens of countries in boycotting the Soviet Games, the world's other superpower decided to answer in kind. If politics could cancel one Olympics, it could cancel 2. Here is the part that should make you uneasy. The Los Angeles Games were not targeted because of anything the athletes did. They were targeted because of what their governments had done before they were even selected. From the moment the US walked away from Moscow, the response in Eastern Europe was predictable. Leaders there watched American speeches about principle and saw something else: hypocrisy. A country that had sent soldiers to Vietnam, supported dictators from Chile to Iran, and now claimed the moral right to boycott someone else's invasion. In private, they made a simple calculation: if we ever get a chance to hit back without firing a shot, we will. This is where it turns. Los Angeles, 1984, was their chance. The Soviet Union and its allies did not announce their boycott with an honest headline. They wrapped it in language you might recognize from a different era: security concerns, anti-Soviet hysteria, politicization of sport by the host nation. On paper, they claimed to be worried that their athletes would not be safe. In reality, they were sending a message: you used the games against us. Now we will use them against you. The mechanism was brutally symmetrical. In May 1984, 3 months before the opening ceremony, the Soviets released a statement. They and most of the Eastern Bloc would not attend the Los Angeles Olympics. They blamed the United States for unprecedented political pressure and said the games had been turned into a tool of propaganda. If you replace the names, it is almost the same argument Washington used 4 years earlier. The human cost, again, fell on people who did not write any of those statements. Athletes in East Germany, the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, and other Eastern Bloc countries had spent 4 years training for Los Angeles. Many of them had not been old enough to compete in Moscow. The boycott of 1980 had hurt their older teammates. Now it was their turn. Think about a Soviet pole vaulter or an East German swimmer who had watched Americans stay home in 1980 and felt secretly relieved. The absence of Western rivals had made it easier to win gold, but those medals came with an asterisk. They knew it. The world knew it. Los Angeles was supposed to fix that. A chance to beat the best with everyone present. A chance to prove that their victories were not just products of a rigged field. The boycott took that away. Here is the moral imbalance. The governments in the East framed their decision as standing up for the Olympic ideal. They accused the United States of planning anti-Soviet demonstrations. They said the American press would humiliate their athletes. But the decision did not protect competitors from politics. It trapped them inside it. Some Eastern Bloc athletes defected rather than accept another stolen games. They left families behind, knowing they might never see them again, because the prospect of losing a second Olympics was unbearable. Others stayed and tried to make peace with the idea that their careers would always be measured against a shadow. This is where it hits your life. If you were a spectator in the West, the Los Angeles Games might still live in your memory as a colorful, triumphant festival. Crowded stadiums, American dominance in the medal table, perfect summer weather. But if you look a little closer at those images, you see what is missing. No Soviet gymnasts on the apparatus. No East German sprinters in the lanes. No battles between the rival superpowers' best athletes. The Olympic ideal says you compete against the strongest opponent you can find. Politics in 1984 gave America the easiest path to victory it had ever had. The boycotts did not just hurt the athletes who stayed home. They cheapened the medals of those who remained. It is not the fault of a U.S. hurdler that her Soviet counterpart was not allowed to come. But the race she won cannot be separated from the race that never happened. And this is the part almost nobody admits. By 1984, both sides had proven the same point. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union believed the Olympics were truly independent. Each was willing to use the gains as a lever when it suited them. The only difference was direction. Washington used absence to protest an invasion. Moscow used absence to protest being protested. To the rest of the world, the effect was the same. If you were in a smaller nation caught between the blocks, you learned that your athletes' dreams could be vetoed by a decision taken thousands of miles away. Not by your own parliament, by someone else's Politburo or National Security Council. After the twin boycotts of 1980 and 1984, The Olympic movement tried to pretend things could go back to normal. But for the people who lived through them, normal had changed. Every time a new host city was announced, the first question was no longer, what will the stadium look like? It was, who will show up? The Cold War would produce more crises, more wars, more invasions. But the Games never fully recovered from those 2 summers. From that point on, every athlete understood an unwritten rule. You can train, you can qualify, you can be the best in the world, but you are never fully in control of whether you get to prove it on the biggest stage. That decision belongs to people who will never step onto the track. And once that truth sinks in, you cannot look at an opening ceremony the same way again. They still light the flame and talk about peace. But after 1980 and 1984, nobody inside the movement could pretend the Games were just about sport. From that point forward, every Olympics carried the memory of 2 summers where politics decided who was allowed to run. Here is the part that gets lost when people say, the boycotts are over. The boycotts ended on paper. The damage did not. Once governments realized the Games could be weaponized, everyone around them had to change how they behaved. Not just presidents and party bosses, organizers, broadcasters, security, services, sponsors. The mechanism of that change shows up in 3 places: where the Games are held, how they are protected, and what they are expected to prove. This is where it turns. Before Moscow, the biggest question a city bid committee had to answer was, can you afford it? After Moscow and Los Angeles, they had to answer a darker one. Can you survive it? Not survive financially. Survive politically. Bidding for the Games became a test of loyalty. In the Cold War, hosting an Olympics meant choosing a side. If you were in the West and your government leaned toward the United States, awarding you the Games signaled that alignment. If you were inside the Soviet sphere, hosting meant Moscow trusted you not to embarrass it. Every decision was read as a message. When Seoul was chosen for 1988, it was not just a nod to South Korea's development. It was a statement that the West believed a fragile dictatorship on the front line of the Cold War could be turned into a showcase for liberalization. The human cost of that decision landed on people who never picked up a javelin. In the years leading up to the Seoul Games, the South Korean regime cracked down on dissidents in the name of security. Protesters were beaten and jailed so that, when the world's cameras arrived, the streets would look orderly. Only when pressure at home and abroad became unbearable did the military move toward elections. The Olympics did not cause democratization. They accelerated a crisis and gave both repression and reform a deadline. That pattern repeated. Barcelona in 1992 became a symbol of a newly unified post-Franco Spain returning to Europe. Beijing 2008 became a global coming-out party for a rising China. In each case, the Games were not just a sporting event. They were a test. Could a country prove in 2 weeks that its system worked? Here is the moral imbalance. The International Olympic Committee still claimed neutrality. It said it did not involve itself in domestic politics. But by awarding the Games, it was passing judgment. Just not on the people affected. If you were a dissident in a host country, the message was clear. Your government now had an additional reason to silence you. Not only were you a threat to order, you were a threat to the national image in front of billions of viewers. Security followed the same path. Before Munich 1972, the idea of heavily armed guards inside Olympic venues was unthinkable. After the hostage massacre there, everything changed. After the twin boycotts, security changed again. Host nations had seen what happened to Moscow when politics disrupted the Games. They were determined not to let protests, terrorism, or boycotts ruin their turn. So they built perimeters, not metaphorical ones. Physical walls, checkpoints, zones where only accredited people could move freely. Every Games since has effectively been held inside a secure bubble carved out of the host city. The human cost of that bubble falls on the people who live just outside it. Residents displaced by new stadiums never meant for long-term use. Neighborhoods cut in half by security corridors. Local businesses strangled by restrictions on who can enter and when. All so that for 2 weeks, television cameras can show a sanitized version of the city where nothing messy intrudes on the brand. And this is the part that makes the post-boycott era feel hollow. The Olympic movement likes to say it learned from 1980 and 1984 that it will never allow politics to steal the games again. But what it actually learned was how to absorb politics without admitting it. Instead of boycotts, you get diplomatic protests. Leaders skip opening ceremonies while their teams still compete. Instead of public threats, you get private pressure. Behind closed doors, governments lean on national committees to raise or lower their profile. Athletes are told not to stage protests on the medal stand. Hosts are told to keep politics out of ceremonies. Broadcasters are told to focus on human interest stories and avoid controversy. The result is not neutrality. It is selective silence. This is where it hits your life. If you have watched the games in the last 20 years, you have seen athletes compete under flags that are not quite flags. Independent Olympic athletes, refugee teams, competitors from countries under sanction who cannot hear their anthems played. Every time that happens, it is a reminder that the ideal of a politics-free arena died long ago. You can see the scars of 1980 and 1984 in every negotiation about who is allowed to march, who is allowed to host, and who is allowed to speak. When Russia was banned from competing under its own flag because of systemic doping, that decision did not emerge from nowhere. It came from a movement still trying to prove it could police itself after decades of looking the other way when powerful nations broke rules. When debates erupt about whether countries involved in current wars should be allowed to host or compete, the ghost of Moscow hangs over the conversation. Do we punish them by staying home? Or have we learned that boycotts mostly hurt athletes and leave governments untouched? The truth is uncomfortable. 1980 taught the world that using the games as a weapon is easy. The years since have taught it that not using them is politically costly. Every host wants the prestige without the scrutiny. Every government wants the medals without the moral accounting. Every athlete wants a clean shot at glory without becoming collateral in a fight they did not start. Those desires cannot all be satisfied at once. The flame still burns at every opening ceremony. Crowds still cheer. Records still fall. But the question lit in 1980 has never gone out. Who really owns this spectacle now? The runners? Or the people who decide which runners are allowed to be seen? Every time the torch is lit, they repeat the same words: peace, friendship, unity. They never say the quiet part, that after 1980, the flame stopped belonging to the people carrying it. Here is the part everyone avoids because it makes the whole spectacle harder to enjoy. The modern Olympics were built on a myth that if you put enough flags in one stadium and enough cameras in one city, politics would somehow take a holiday. That myth died the moment superpowers discovered the games were a useful tool. The rest of this story is just the autopsy. This is where it turns. Look at what happened to the Olympic brand after the twin boycotts. Every bid, every sponsorship, every controversy circles around the same question. Who is this really for now? On paper, the answer is simple. Athletes, children watching at home. The youth of the world, as every opening ceremony script puts it. In practice, the answer is uglier. The games now exist to do three things: make host governments look legitimate, make sponsors look generous, make audiences forget, for 2 weeks, how little any of that has to do with them. The mechanism that locks this in is money. Hosting costs exploded after 1980. Security budgets alone multiplied. Broadcast deals reached into the billions. Tickets, tourism, and corporate hospitality became non-negotiable line items. Once that much money is on the line, You cannot afford true neutrality. You have to pick winners. You have to decide which countries are stable enough to host, which regimes are tolerable enough to be photographed with, which scandals are small enough to ignore. That is politics, not the kind that involves tanks. The kind that involves brand safety meetings. The human cost hides behind those decisions. When Beijing got the Games in 2008, the Olympic movement called it a chance to open China to the world. What it actually did was give a one-party state an enormous stage to present itself as modern, efficient, and unstoppable. Stadiums rose where neighborhoods used to be. Activists who tried to use the moment to highlight human rights abuses found themselves silenced, detained, or pushed off camera. Athletes were told to avoid sensitive topics. To the people living in Beijing's ring roads, the Games were not just a festival. They were a reminder that their city, and by extension, their lives, could be rebuilt overnight to serve an image. Not their image, someone else's. London, Rio, Sochi, Tokyo each repeated the pattern in different ways. Promises that the Games would leave a legacy of infrastructure and opportunity. Reality that they often left debt, white elephant arenas, and resentment in communities displaced or priced out. This is where it hits your life. If you live in a rich country, you are told the Olympics are a gift, a chance to show off, to bring the world to your doorstep. If you live in a poor country, you are told they are an investment. They will raise your profile, attract tourists, create jobs. If you are an athlete, you are told they are a reward, proof that sacrifice pays off. But in all three cases, the people making the decisions are not the ones absorbing the risk. Politicians get to cut ribbons and stand in VIP boxes. Sponsors get global advertising they could never buy any other way. Broadcasters get 2 weeks of guaranteed content. If things go wrong, the bill does not land on their desks. It lands on taxpayers and athletes. You can see the moral imbalance in the way scandals are handled. Systemic doping in one powerful nation, years of looking the other way. When the evidence becomes too overwhelming, you punish the flag, not the individuals who authorized the program. Corruption in the bidding process? Occasional arrests of low-level officials. The Games go on. Bribery, environmental damage, forced evictions? Folded into the cost of doing business. The Olympic machine absorbs each hit because the alternative would be admitting that the entire structure is built on compromises most viewers would find deeply uncomfortable. And yet people keep watching. Here is the uncomfortable truth. We watch because the moments on the track and in the pool are still real. The relay exchange has to be clean. The bar in gymnastics still falls or stays up based on physics, not politics. A race can be ruined by a stumble, not a speech. Those moments let us pretend briefly that the Games are what they say they are. But the system surrounding them tells a different story. Tickets cost more than many families can afford. Hospitality packages exist for people who could pay for a private jet. Cities bid for the privilege of losing money to impress other governments. None of that is accidental. It is the logical conclusion of the year. Politicians first realized the Olympics could be weaponized. 1980 was not a one-off mistake. It was the pivot point. Before Moscow, politics occasionally intruded on the Games. After Moscow, politics owned them. Every debate since about whether to let a country compete, whether to award a city hosting rights, whether to allow athletes to kneel or speak, or where a symbol sits on that fault line. Are these Games for the world's citizens? Or are they a show the world's governments put on for each other? When you hear officials insist that the Olympics must remain above politics, remember who benefits when you believe that. It is never the person who lost their home to make way for a stadium. It is never the athlete whose peak was spent in a boycotted year. It is never the worker who built venues in dangerous conditions and walked away with a temporary job and a permanent injury. It is the people who can fly in and out in 2 days, give a speech, and leave with a photo. The flame still looks the same on television. But once you understand who holds the lighter, it is hard to see it as a symbol of anything pure. 1980 did not just break the Olympics. It revealed what they had always been at their core. A mirror held up to power, polished just enough that you do not see the fingerprints on the glass.